I stood at the airport gate with my suitcase, ready for the trip I had planned and paid for, down to the last dollar, when I saw him standing there with my family, a suitcase of his own beside him, and I knew before anyone said a word that something had already been decided without me. My name is Caroline Hayes. I am 33 years old, and for 2 years I had quietly paid my sister's rent, covered my parents' bills, and funded a trip meant to reconnect our family with the place we grew up in, all without asking for anything back. That morning, my sister Brooke looked at me and said her boyfriend Tyler was more important right now, that I needed to understand and forgive her, and that they were taking my seat on a trip I had built from nothing. I said, "Have a good trip," turned around, and walked out of that airport a completely different person than the one who walked in, because by the time they landed, I had already started making decisions that would change everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how I ended up standing alone in that terminal, you need to know who I was before that morning. I worked at a respected consulting firm downtown, and after years of long hours and careful saving, I owned 2 apartments in the city. I lived in the larger one near the waterfront, and I had always planned to rent out the smaller studio for extra income. That plan changed when my parents asked me to let my younger sister live there instead, rent-free, while she got back on her feet. Brooke was 28, 5 years younger than me, and she had always been the one my parents worried about, protected and excused. I told myself I didn't mind helping. That's what family does, I thought. I never once considered that the more I gave, the more it would simply be expected of me, quietly, permanently, without gratitude. My parents were in their early 60s, hard-working but never wealthy. My father picked up part-time construction inspection jobs when his back allowed it, and my mother, a licensed nurse, took whatever shifts she could get. Every month, without fail, I transferred $1,150 into their account to help cover groceries, utilities, and medication. I never made a show of it. I just did it. The way you do something so long it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like an obligation you forgot you agreed to. Looking back now, I can see how easily that quiet generosity became something else entirely. A kind of invisible contract where I gave everything and expected only to be remembered kindly for it. I wasn't asking for gratitude. I was only asking not to be forgotten. The idea for the trip began 6 months earlier, on an ordinary afternoon at my parents' house. My mother had decided to clean out the attic and found an old photo album none of us had seen in decades, filled with pictures from Maui, where our family had lived until I was 9 years old. There we were, small and sunburned, laughing on a beach that no longer felt real. My mother traced her finger over a photo of herself and my father as young newlyweds, and I watched something soften in her face I hadn't seen in years. "We should go back," I said, almost without thinking. "Recreate the photos, stand in the same places." My mother's eyes lit up in a way that made the idea feel important, urgent even, like a debt we owed to the people we used to be. I wanted to plan it myself, but work had buried me alive that season, 12-hour days bleeding into weekends I never got back. "I wish I could handle everything," I told my family honestly, "but I just don't have the time right now." Brooke, sensing an opportunity to finally contribute something, offered to take it on. "I'll book the flights," she said, "the hotel, even a photographer to recreate the old pictures exactly." I trusted her completely, wired her $9,400 to cover everything, and watched confirmation emails land in my inbox one after another. I felt relieved, even proud of her. For the first time in years, I thought, my sister is stepping up. I had no idea that trust would be the very thing used against me 3 months later, when a stranger named Tyler walked into her life and quietly began rearranging all of ours. Tyler was 30, worked in product marketing at some forgettable startup, and appeared in Brooke's life with the kind of suddenness that should have made all of us pause. Within weeks, she was distracted, distant, rearranging her schedule around him without explanation. Then, 3 months before the trip, She announced she wasn't coming at all. My relationship is more important right now, she said flatly, as though months of planning and thousands of my dollars meant nothing beside a man she'd known for weeks. My parents were upset. I was furious, and for a moment, it seemed like the trip might collapse entirely under the weight of her decision. Then, a week later, just as abruptly, she reversed herself. "Never mind," she said, smiling like nothing had happened. "I'm coming after all." None of us questioned why. We were simply relieved to have our family whole again, or so we believed. The morning of the trip, I arrived at the airport early, practically vibrating with excitement to see the place where my earliest memories lived. I spotted my parents and Brooke across the terminal and started walking toward them with my suitcase rolling behind me, already imagining the beach, the photographs, the four of us standing where two young newlyweds once stood decades ago. Then I saw him, Tyler, standing beside my sister with a suitcase of his own, dressed like a man who had already been told he belonged there. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up to what I was looking at. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that he was simply there to say goodbye, that the suitcase meant nothing. I was wrong about all of it, and within seconds, my sister would confirm exactly how wrong I was. "You need to understand and forgive me," Brooke said, not even bothering to soften her voice. "But we're taking Tyler instead of you. He's more important than you are right now." I felt the words land somewhere deep in my chest, a kind of pain that didn't announce itself loudly, but simply settled in and stayed. My mother stepped forward, smiling as though she were delivering good news. "They're getting engaged soon," she explained. "They need this time together." "I'll see you later," Brooke added, already turning toward the gate. "This is a romantic trip for us." My father said nothing at all. Then my mother, almost as an afterthought, reminded me to water the flowers at their house while they were gone, as if my only remaining purpose that week was to maintain the home of the people who had just erased me from my own vacation. I don't remember walking out of that airport. I remember sitting in the back of a taxi with my suitcase still packed beside me, staring out the window at a city that suddenly felt unfamiliar. When I got home, I sat on my couch in silence for a long time before I finally called my best friend, Meredith Cole, someone I had known since college and trusted with every version of myself I had ever been. She picked up within minutes of my text, alarmed, asking why I wasn't on a plane. When I told her everything, the trip, the money, the airport, Tyler standing there with a suitcase like he'd earned a place I had paid for, she went quiet for a long moment before saying the words that would end up changing the direction of everything that followed. "That is the most messed up thing I have ever heard." That night I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to at the airport, all the shock finally breaking loose into something rawer and harder to control. Meredith didn't try to talk me out of my feelings. She simply told me to pack a bag and come stay with her at her family's lake house for the weekend, insisting I needed distance before I made any decisions I might regret. I agreed, mostly because I didn't trust myself to be alone in that apartment, while photos from Maui inevitably began appearing on my phone. The drive out of the city that evening felt like crossing some invisible threshold, leaving behind the version of myself who always said yes, who always gave, who always assumed love was something you earned through sacrifice, rather than something freely given in return. Meredith's lake house sat quiet and golden in the early evening light when I arrived, wine already breathing on the counter, groceries stacked for a weekend she clearly intended to use wisely. We spent that first night talking on the dock with our feet in the cold water, and for the first time I said out loud everything I had been quietly absorbing for years, not just about the trip, but about the rent-free apartment, the monthly transfers, the years of being the reliable one, while my sister remained the beloved one. Meredith listened without interrupting, then finally said something that stopped me completely. "You know what your problem is," she said gently. "You're too nice. There's a difference between helping people and enabling them to treat you like nothing." The next morning, we walked the perimeter of the lake in silence for a while, the kind of silence that lets thoughts finally organize themselves into something clear. "What do you actually want, Caroline?" Meredith asked eventually. and I found myself answering without hesitation. "I want to be respected," I said. "I want my family to appreciate what I give them, instead of assuming it will always be there. I want to stop being taken for granted." Saying it out loud made it undeniable, and undeniable things demand action. We spent the rest of that day turning vague anger into an actual plan, weighing every option from calm confrontation to complete withdrawal, until something in me settled on the version that felt less like revenge and more like consequence. By Sunday morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I told Meredith over coffee exactly what I intended to do, and she smiled, like she had been waiting for me to arrive at that decision on my own. Tyler had been living in my studio apartment for months without ever asking my permission, and that ended today. My parents, who had chosen silence and smiles at that airport gate, were about to discover that my generosity had never been guaranteed, only offered freely, and now freely withdrawn. I drove back into the city that evening, feeling like a different person than the one who had left. No longer the sister who absorbed every disappointment quietly, but someone who finally understood that love without respect was simply another name for being used. Monday morning, I called in sick to work, though nothing about what I felt was accidental or uncontrolled. I drove straight to the studio apartment, let myself in with my own key, and stood in the doorway taking in just how thoroughly Tyler had settled into a life I was funding. His clothes hung beside my sister's in the closet. His razor sat on the bathroom sink, like it had always belonged there. His gaming console was wired into the television I had purchased years earlier, for a sister I was trying to help, not a stranger I had never invited in. I went to my car, retrieved a stack of garbage bags from the trunk, and began packing up every trace of both of them, methodically, without rage, the way you might finally clean out a wound you'd been ignoring for too long. It took nearly 3 hours to empty that apartment completely, and with every bag I filled, the shock of the airport hardened into something closer to resolve. I loaded everything into my car and drove to my parents' house, letting myself in with the spare key they had given me years ago for emergencies, just like this one, though certainly never imagining it would be used this way. I watered their plants exactly as my mother had asked, a small, almost absurd act of order in the middle of everything I was about to dismantle, then set every bag down in the middle of their living room floor. "There," I said quietly to an empty house. Problem solved. Then I locked the door behind me and got back in my car. That afternoon, I called a locksmith and had the studio apartment's locks changed before Brooke or Tyler could ever attempt to return. I called a realtor I trusted from years earlier and asked her to find new tenants as quickly as possible, explaining simply that the previous occupants had already moved out. Then I opened my banking app and cancelled the automatic transfer of $1,150 I had sent my parents every single month for 3 consecutive years. I called their internet provider and ended the service. I called their streaming account and cancelled it. I removed them from my phone plan entirely. Every quiet form of support I had extended without complaint for years, I withdrew in the space of a single afternoon, methodically, calmly, without a single moment of second-guessing myself. While all of this unfolded, my family had no idea anything had changed. Every day of their trip, photos arrived on my phone. My mother at a luau, my father in front of the ocean, Brooke and Tyler wrapped around each other on a beach I had once dreamed of standing on myself. Having the most amazing time, my mother texted one afternoon, "Wish you were here." I stared at that message for a long time before sending back a single smiley face, giving away nothing of what I had already done at home. "Look at this sunset," Brooke wrote a few days later. "So romantic." Another smiley face, another silence, stretched taut across thousands of miles. They had no idea they were sending vacation photos from a trip I funded to someone who had already dismantled the entire foundation beneath them. The messages continued for the rest of the week, an unrelenting stream of gratitude directed at everything except me. My father finally acknowledged, almost in passing, that I had made the whole trip possible, thanking me for it in a text sandwiched between photos of a hotel suite I would never see in person. I answered with the same small, empty emoji I had been sending all week, giving them exactly as much honesty as they had given me at that airport gate. None of them seemed to notice the silence underneath my replies, too consumed by their own happiness to wonder why the person who had made all of it possible had gone so quiet. That silence, I would later understand, was the last calm moment before everything I had done finally caught up with them. The call came Sunday evening, my mother's name lighting up my phone as their flight touched back down. I let it go to voicemail, unwilling to hear her voice before I was ready. Within minutes, my phone filled with frantic messages, first from my mother, then my father, then Brooke, all asking the same disjointed questions. Why is Brooke's furniture piled in our living room? Why can't she get back into her apartment? What happened while we were gone? I read every message and answered none of them, letting the silence stretch until an hour later, when 3 sets of footsteps and a heavy round of knocking arrived at my own front door, impossible to ignore any longer. I opened the door to find all 3 of them standing there, confusion and anger written plainly across their faces, and they moved past me into my apartment without waiting to be invited, the same way they had always assumed access to my life without asking. "What did you do?" my mother demanded immediately, insisting I had no right to remove Brooke from that apartment. "We're family," my father added. "We're supposed to support each other." Brooke stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, demanding to know where she was supposed to live, now that I had upended her life so suddenly. I looked at the 3 of them for a long moment, before I finally spoke the words I had been rehearsing in my head for an entire week. "You chose Tyler over me," I said evenly. "You decided he mattered more than I did, so now you can figure out the rest without my help." My mother tried to argue that cancelling the payments was different, unrelated, an overreaction to something unconnected, but I simply continued listing everything I had already ended: the transfers, the internet, the phone plan, the realtor already searching for new tenants. Brooke's face went pale as the full weight of what I had done finally registered. "You can stay with Mum and Dad," I told her calmly, and then I asked all 3 of them to leave my apartment, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. They argued for a few more minutes, but I had already stopped listening, because I had said everything I needed to say. After they left that night, I sat alone in the quiet of my apartment, caught somewhere between relief and grief, proud of myself for finally speaking up, but mourning the version of my family I had always hoped existed. I told myself firmly that I had done the right thing, even as the ache of it settled into my chest. Within days, Brooke began texting threats, insisting she had legal rights to that apartment after 2 years of paying utilities, promising to take me to court if I didn't let her back in. Unsure whether she actually had a case, I called my lawyer, a careful man named Gregory Marsh, who had handled both of my property purchases years earlier. He listened patiently, then told me plainly that paying utilities created no ownership claim whatsoever, and that she had no legal standing at all. My parents tried a different approach entirely, leaving voicemails soaked in guilt about family and forgiveness, insisting we raised you better than this, as though raising me had ever included teaching me my own limits. When guilt failed, they enlisted relatives, and one aunt called, demanding to know why I would do something so cruel to my own parents. I asked her calmly if they had told her what actually happened at that airport, and when she admitted she hadn't heard that part, I explained it plainly: the money, the substitution, the suitcase waiting where mine should have been. There was a long silence on the line before she finally admitted she hadn't realized it was that serious. After that conversation, the calls from relatives stopped entirely, as if the truth alone had been enough to end the campaign against me. Weeks passed before life began settling into its new shape. I ran into a friend of Brooke's at the grocery store one afternoon, who mentioned almost casually that Tyler had broken things off, apparently unwilling to handle the reality of living crowded into my parents' house after losing his free apartment. I felt nothing close to satisfaction hearing it, only a quiet confirmation that the relationship I had funded a vacation to celebrate had never been built to last in the first place. A month later, my mother called again, her voice softer than before, suggesting we plan another trip, just the four of us this time, promising they would cover the costs themselves. I told her simply that money had never been the real problem. "You showed me exactly how much I matter to this family," I said, and after that, the calls finally stopped altogether. Life continued forward in the months that followed, quieter, steadier, entirely my own. The realtor found new tenants for the studio within 2 weeks, renting it for more than Brooke and Tyler had ever paid, and I redirected that extra income straight into my retirement account instead of anyone else's bills. My father returned to full-time work, my sister moved back into her childhood bedroom, and I finally began building a life centered around my own needs instead of everyone else's expectations. Some evenings, I catch myself thinking about Maui again, not with anger this time, but with a quiet curiosity about returning there someday, entirely on my own terms, not to recreate old photographs, but simply to stand on that shore and know exactly who I am now. Sometimes the only way to finally stand tall is to first stand completely alone,